Hello everyone, my name is Shenghao. Today I'm going to talk about hyperflow diffusion, which is a diffusion method for hypergraphs. First of all, the reason we are interested in hypergraphs is that they are everywhere. Hypergraphs generalize graphs by allowing a hyperedge to contain more than two nodes that capture higher order relations in the data. For example, in e-commerce, where nodes are products or web pages, it is common to see that more than two products are purchased at the same time, or usually we see that a number of web pages are visited during the same session. In a collaboration network where nodes are authors, it is also common to see that a group of more than two authors collaborate on a paper or project. Finally, in ecology, where nodes are species, we usually see that multiple species interact according to their roles in the food chain. All of these are naturally modeled by hypergraphs. On the other hand, we are interested in diffusion algorithms because they are everywhere as well. For example, I did a quick search on Google Scholar with keywords network diffusion, and it returned me 4.2 million results. So in some sense, it kind of indicates that diffusions are really popular. In this work, we view diffusion on a graph as the process of spreading a given amount of initial mass from some seed node to neighbor nodes using the edges in the graph. For example, in the figures at the bottom, we show a kind of cartoon representation of a diffusion process in the graph. In the leftmost figure, we start the diffusion from a single seed node in the middle and gradually or iteratively it spreads mass to the neighbors. There are a lot of applications for diffusion algorithms. For example, recommendation systems, node ranking, community detection, social and biological network analysis. On the other hand, a similar search of hypergraph diffusion didn't return as many results. This kind of indicates that hypergraph diffusion has been significantly less explored. There are some methods for hypergraph diffusion, but these existing methods either do not have a tight theoretical implication or do not model complex higher order relations or are not scalable. So, motivated by the limitations of existing method for hypergraph diffusion, in this work we proposed the first local diffusion method that achieves stronger theoretical guarantees for the local hypergraph clustering problem. And at the same time, it applies to a substantially richer class of higher order relations with only a some modularity assumption. And finally, it permits computationally efficient algorithms. Let me start by talking about the modeling of higher order relations from a hyperedge cut perspective. I'm going to look at a very simple example, which is a hyperedge that contains only four nodes. But already in this simple case, there are different ways to cut this hyperedge into two parts. So a natural question to ask is that how are we going to treat different ways to cut this hyperedge differently? Okay, it turns out that we can define a function that specifies the cost of splitting this hyperedge into two parts. And we are going to denote this function by WE. The next question to consider is that what classes of cut cost functions we will be looking at. In the simplest case, it doesn't matter how are we going to cut the hyperedge. The cost is always going to be a constant, for example, 1. And we call this case the unit cut cost. Okay? In a slightly more general setting, we have the cardinality-based cut cost, where the cost of cutting a hyperedge depends on the number of nodes in either side of the hyperedge. For example, in the figure, if we cut out only one node, we incur a cost of 1. If we cut out two nodes, then we incur a cost of 2. Okay. Finally, the most general cut cost we're going to consider in this work is when the function is submodular. In this figure, I give you an example where the function is submodular but not cardinality based. For example, if we look at this figure, if we cut off either node v1 or v2, then we have a cost of 1. But if we want to cut off v1 and v2 together, we incur a cost of 0. This way of defining cut cost naturally encourages the separation between nodes v1, v2 and nodes v3, v4. and in some applications, it can be really useful. Alternatively, we can also view the modeling of higher order relations from a hyperedge flow perspective. But how are we going to define flows over hyperedges? It turns out that it suffices to associate each node in the edge with a number. For example, in the left figure, the numbers in this figure indicates that V1 sends 2 unit mass to V2. That's why we have a +2 at V1 and -2 at V2. Similarly, the same idea generalized to hyperedges. Formally, for each hyperedge E, we define a vector RE that specifies the flow values. And in order to make sure that the values in RE actually define proper flow values, we require that the entries in RE sums to 0. And this is also what we call as flow conservation. And besides flow conservation, we can impose additional constraints on RE in order to make sure that the flow values respect the higher order relations we want to model. But before we get into details, I want to show you this comparison, which indicates that kind of shows that the definitions we talked about is actually a natural generalization of network flows to hypergraphs. As a recap, we have introduced a primal dual view of the modeling of higher order relations. From a cut perspective, we have a set function that specifies the cut cost of splitting a hyperedge into two parts, and we require the function to be submodular. From a flow perspective, we have a vector that defines the flow over the hyperedge, and we will see later that we require the vector to be in the cone generated by the base polytope of the submodular cut cost function. Let me now introduce hyperflow diffusion. I'm going to use the figure on the right as our working example to go over definitions. We are going to use the vector delta to specify the initial mass on nodes. For example, node V7 has initial mass 5, and let's assume that all other nodes have initial mass 0. As said before, we are going to use the vectors RE to specify the flow routings over hyperedges. The corresponding entries in REs are already labeled in the figure right now. And given the flow routings and initial mass, we can now compute the net mass on nodes. For example, node V7 started with the initial mass 5, it sends out 4 unit mass to other nodes. It is now left with net mass 1. Okay? We require that each node to have a capacity that equals to the degree. For example, the degree of node V6 equals 1, so node V6 has a capacity 1. However, the net mass on V6 is 2 right now, which exceeds the capacity. And this leads to the notion of feasible flow routings. A set of flow routings are called feasible if the net mass is no more than the degree after routing for each node. Our hyperflow diffusion problem basically seeks for the feasible flow routings that also have the minimum L2 norm cost. It is formulated as an optimization problem. Now, in the objective function, I have not introduced the variables phi e's yet, but for now, you can think of phi e as the magnitude of flow. The first constraint is the capacity constraint we talked about, which requires that the net mass to be no more than the degree, and this forces diffusion of initial mass. The second constraint is the flow conservation we talked about, but also remember that we said flow conservation alone cannot be rich enough to model higher order relations. Therefore, we replace it with a new constraint. The set BE in the new constraint is the base polytope for the submodular cut cost function WE. And if you look at this new constraint, it should be clear now that phi e's are really the magnitude of flow. Okay? So this is almost our final formulation, except that we introduce a few additional terms for computational efficiency reasons. This also has a very nice physical interpretation, but because of time, I'm going to omit that. The dual problem is written as follows. The expression in the red box can be seen as a quadratic form with respect to a nonlinear hypergraph Laplacian operator. For standard graphs, it reduces to the quadratic form with respect to the standard Laplacian matrix for graphs. The functions Fe are the lowest extensions for the submodular functions We. Okay, we actually use the dual solution for node ranking and clustering applications. And physically, the entries in X measure the access mass on nodes after diffusion. Now let's talk about local clustering. In this problem, we are given a set of seed node, and the goal is to find low conductance cluster around the seed. The conductance of a cluster is basically the ratio between the cut values on the top and volumes on the bottom. In our diffusion, we assign initial mass to the seed node. Under the assumptions that there is some overlap between the seed and the target cluster, and the parameter is not too large, then we can show that by applying sweep cut on the optimal dual solution, we can obtain a cluster whose conductance is at most the square root of the target. Let me emphasize that this is the first result that is independent of hyperedge size in general. I mean, for general cut cost functions. All right, algorithm. Remember that we have formulated hyperflow diffusion as an optimization problem, and we are going to use the optimal solution to perform either node ranking or local clustering. So we have to solve an optimization problem. In order to do that, we solve an equivalent primal reformulation, which is separable, so it can be solved by alternating minimization. The resulting algorithm only touches a small part of the hypergraph. For example, the figures show the number of nodes touched by the algorithm on 3 different clusters in a big hypergraph constructed from Amazon reviews data. The hypergraph has more than 2 million nodes, but if you look at the plot, the number of nodes touched by the algorithm during the execution of the algorithm is actually a very small fraction of the hypergraph. In the plots, the black dashed line is the true number of non-zeros in the output. So this kind of indicates that the running time of the algorithm only depends on the size of the output, but not on the input hypergraph size. This is nice, and because this is important for the algorithms to scale up to really large hypergraphs. And we actually had similar observations in all our experiments. On the other hand, proving that in theory the worst case running time is indeed strongly local is still an open problem. Finally, let's look at some empirical results. The first one we consider is synthetic experiment using cardinality-based K-uniform hypergraph stochastic block model. In this setting, we allow boundary hyperedges to appear with different probabilities according to the cardinality of hyperedge cut. For example, if we consider hyperedges that contain 6 nodes, then essentially there are only 3 different types of boundary hyperedges, which are shown here in the middle. And they can appear with different probabilities Q1, Q2, and Q3. In particular, we consider Q1 to be significantly larger than both Q2 and Q3. And in this case, it kind of means that boundary hyperedges that contains one node in one cluster and the other 5 nodes in another cluster happen much more often than more balanced hyperedges in the later 2 cases. Okay, and in this setting, we should kind of expect that using cardinality-based cut cost should help with clustering, which is also verified later on in our experiments. As a side note, unless I state explicitly, all our experiments use a single seed node to recover the target cluster. In this slide, the 2 plots show conductance and F1 results for local clustering in 4 different hypergraphs that have different constant hyperedge sizes. The hyperedge sizes range from k equals 3 to k equals 6. We compare our method HFD with 2 other methods. The first one is LH, which is a strongly local hypergraph diffusion method that is based on graph reduction. The second one is ACL, which is a heuristic method that uses PageRank on the star expansion of the hypergraph. By the way, HFD is the only method here that directly works on the original hypergraph. In the labels, a prefix U means that the method uses unit cut cost, and a prefix C means that the method uses cardinality-based cut cost. For each method, we run it multiple times, and in the plots, we use markers to plot the median, and we use error bars to plot the 25 and 75 percentile of the results. Observe that for each method, whether it is LH or it is HFD, cardinality-based cut cost is going to produce a better result than the corresponding unit cut cost in terms of both conductance and F1 score. On the other hand, if you look at CLH, which is colored in orange, there is a significant performance drop going from k equals 3 to k equals 4. This is because that the theoretical conductance guarantee for LH has a dependence on the hyperedge size. On the other hand, since the conductance guarantee for our method is independent of hyperedge size, so in particular, if we look at CHFD, which is colored in red, the performance in terms of both conductance and F1 does not seem to be affected by the hyperedge size. Now let's look at some empirical results on real hypergraphs. The first hypergraph is constructed from Amazon product reviews data. The table summarizes the median results for local clustering on a number of different clusters. There are two versions of LH. One is linear and the other is nonlinear. In our experiments with real data, we actually compare with both linear and nonlinear versions of LH. From the table, it is clear that HFD produces the best results in terms of both conductance and F1 score, and also in both scenarios when we use either single seed node or multiple seed nodes. In this data set, we only show results for unit cut cost because in our experiments, we saw that unit cut cost performs better than cardinality-based cut cost. The next hypergraph is constructed from Microsoft co-authorship data. And if you look at the results, they are kind of similar, and HFD is better in terms of both conductance and F1 score. The third hypergraph is constructed from travel meta search data. If you look at the table, then we see that HFD still gives overall the best results. However, we also observe that cardinality-based cut cost performs better than unit cut cost for this data set. Finally, as our last example, I'm going to show that specialized submodular cut cost can be necessary for getting good results in both node ranking and local clustering applications. In particular, I'm going to look at a Florida Bay food network. For node ranking, our goal is to search for the most relevant species of a queried species. Intuitively, if we search for a bird, then we want to return other birds. If we search for a fish, then we want to return other fish. Because of this, if we look at the table, then evidently both unit cut cost and cardinality-based cut cost fail in this purpose. On the other hand, submodular cut cost is the only method that returns meaningful results. The success in node ranking is also reflected in the much higher F1 scores for clustering. Finally, I want to say that HFD is the only local diffusion method that works with general submodular cut costs, which is a unique advantage. As a last note, I would like to mention that we have more experiments and a lot more details on both synthetic and real datasets, and these are in the preprint archive. Thank you.